hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when he set my bags down on my mother's porch and drove away without looking back. I stood there in the November cold, holding my daughter in a car seat I could barely lift because they'd cut through my abdominal muscles 4 days earlier, and I watched his taillights disappear around the corner. My mother opened the door before I could even knock. She'd seen him pull up. She'd watched him leave. She didn't say anything. She just took the car seat from my hand and walked inside, and I followed her because there was nowhere else to go. His note was in the diaper bag. I found it 2 hours later when I was looking for the nipple cream. You need to focus on healing. My mother needs peace right now. We'll figure everything out when the time is right. That was it. No, I love you. No, call me when you're settled. Just those 3 sentences, written on a post-it in his neat architect's handwriting, like he was leaving a reminder about taking the trash out. My daughter was 4 days old. She still had the little yellow tinge of newborn jaundice under her eyes. She didn't know yet that her father had just decided the timing was inconvenient. I named her after my grandmother. I'd wanted to name her something that meant something. My husband, I still called him that in my head, for a long time after that, had preferred something more classic. We'd argued about it for 2 months. I won, technically. He wasn't there to argue anymore. The first week at my mother's house, I barely slept. That's not unusual for a new mother, I know. But it wasn't the baby keeping me up. My daughter was actually a good sleeper in those early weeks, which felt like a cruelty because it gave me too many hours alone in the dark to think. I thought about the year we'd been together before she was born, the way he'd been different in the beginning, attentive, almost intense about it, how that had faded so gradually I didn't notice until it was mostly gone. I thought about the night I told him I was pregnant. He hadn't smiled. He'd gone very still, the way he did when he was calculating something, and then he said, "Okay, we'll make this work. Not we're going to be parents, not I'm going to love this baby, just a problem management response." I should have known then. But I hadn't known. Or I had known and refused to let myself know, which is a different thing entirely. By week 3, I stopped thinking about him and started thinking about the envelope. 2 days before I'd gone into labor, a letter had arrived at our apartment addressed to my husband. I'd set it on the counter and forgotten about it in the chaos of the hospital bag and the false alarm on Monday, and the real thing on Thursday, when his mother had packed my belongings. Yes, his mother had been the one to pack my things, not him, which tells you something. She'd apparently swept the whole counter into a box. The letter ended up in my mother's garage with everything else. It was from Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law. I recognized the name because my husband had mentioned his grandfather's estate was being handled by them. His grandfather had died in October, 2 weeks before my daughter was born. My husband had flown out for the funeral and come back quieter than usual, which I'd attributed to grief. I didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to me. But I held it for a long time. The thing about being abandoned with a newborn is that it clarifies things, priorities, yes, but also your understanding of your own situation. I was 29 years old. I had a master's degree in education policy that I'd finished the year before. I had $4,200 in my personal savings account, which I knew because I'd checked 3 times since coming home from the hospital. I was on my husband's health insurance. I did not have a job because we had agreed, he had suggested and I had agreed, that I would take a year off after the baby came. I had a 4-day-old daughter and no income and a husband who had left a post-it note. I thought about my options very carefully. I thought about them the way you think about a math problem when there's no room to get it wrong. On day 9, I called his grandfather's widow. I want to be precise about why I did this. It wasn't spontaneous. I'd been thinking about it for almost a week. My husband's grandfather had been a substantial figure in commercial real estate development in the Southeast. Not famous wealthy, but quietly, seriously wealthy. The kind of family that had a trust and a foundation and a family attorney they'd used for 30 years. My husband came from the branch that had drifted. His father had made bad investments in his 30s and spent the rest of his life being quietly resentful of the cousins who hadn't. My husband had grown up in that resentment without inheriting the money. His grandfather, from what I had gathered over 2 years of family dinners, had not thought much of his son, my father-in-law, but had been openly fond of my husband. The one who got the brains back, he'd said once, at Christmas, which was mortifying for everyone at the table except the grandfather, who didn't care. When my husband had flown home from the funeral, he'd been quiet. Now I understood the quiet differently. I found her number through the estate attorney's website. I called on it Tuesday morning when my daughter was napping and my mother was at the grocery store, and I had a window of exactly the kind of privacy I needed. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was measured and low, the voice of a woman who had spent decades navigating rooms where other people were always trying to read her. I introduced myself. I told her I was her late husband's granddaughter-in-law. I told her I had delivered his great-granddaughter 11 days ago. I told her my husband had left me at my mother's house with a note, and I had not heard from him since. There was a silence. "He hasn't mentioned the baby," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what he's mentioned," I said. "I haven't spoken to him." Another silence, longer this time. "How is the baby?" she asked. "She's healthy. She's beautiful." My voice didn't crack. I was proud of that. I thought you should know she exists. She asked me to come to lunch the following Thursday. I want to be honest about what I was doing. I was not naive about it. I was a woman with a newborn and no income, and I was calling the matriarch of a wealthy family because my husband had connected me to that family and then removed himself from the picture, and I believed, correctly, as it turned out, that the connection didn't have to leave with him. Was that calculating? Yes. I've never pretended otherwise, even to myself. Was it wrong? I've thought about that question for 4 years. I still don't have a simple answer. What I know is that my daughter needed things. Health insurance, first of all, stability, a future, and I was the only person in her life who was actively trying to provide those things, so I used every legitimate tool available to me. His grandfather's widow. I'll call her my grandmother-in-law because that's what she became. Lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house that was large enough to feel significant but not ostentatious. She met me at the door herself, which told me something about how she operated. She was in her late 70s, small-framed, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of conscious effort. She looked at my daughter for a long time before she said anything. "She has his nose," she finally said. "The good side of the family's nose." I laughed. I don't know why. It wasn't especially funny, but it was the first time I'd laughed in almost 2 weeks, and it felt like something releasing in my chest. We had lunch. We talked for 3 hours. She asked me about my education, my work history, what I'd done before I'd agreed to step back, what I wanted to do when I was ready to step forward again. She asked about the note. I showed it to her on my phone. I'd taken a photo before I threw the original away. She looked at it for a long time. "His father did something similar," she said. "Different circumstances, same handwriting, more or less." She handed my phone back. Spiritually, I mean. I didn't push her on that. Before I left, she asked if she could set up a college fund for my daughter. She said she wanted to do it directly, not through my husband, and she wanted my daughter's name on it as the sole beneficiary. She said she'd have her attorney draw up the paperwork and send it to me within the week. I said yes. That was the beginning. Over the next 4 years, I rebuilt. I want to be clear that it was not graceful or triumphant. It was slow and exhausting, and there were months when I didn't know how I was going to make the next month work. My mother helped with childcare so I could go back to work. I took a position with a nonprofit focused on early childhood education policy, a step down from where I'd been before but a foot back in the door. I worked hard. I got promoted twice. I moved my daughter and myself into a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was genuinely fine. Not glamorous, but safe and close to a good park. My grandmother-in-law and I had lunch every 6 to 8 weeks. She would drive into the city, or I would drive out to her, and we would eat and talk, and she would hold my daughter on her lap and read to her from whatever picture book she'd ordered that week. She had opinions about children's literature, strong ones. She did not care for the books where animals learned to share. She preferred the ones where animals had adventures. I never asked her for anything beyond that first lunch. I want to be clear about that too. The college fund was her idea. The birthday gifts were her idea. The envelope she left at my apartment one afternoon, inside which was a check that covered 14 months of my daughter's childcare costs, was her idea. I thanked her. I told her it wasn't necessary. She told me that she was 80 years old and she knew what was and wasn't necessary and I should cash the check. I cashed the check. My husband and I never formally divorced in the first year. I know that sounds strange. The situation was complicated by the fact that he'd moved out of state. He'd gone to work for a firm in Denver, I found out through a mutual friend, and I was too exhausted in those early months to initiate the process. And then when I had the energy, I spoke to a family law attorney who pointed out some specifics about timing and marital assets that made me less inclined to rush. I filed in the second year. It was uncomplicated, which told me he hadn't accumulated much worth claiming either. The decree was finalized on a Thursday afternoon. I picked up my daughter from daycare, and we got ice cream, and I didn't explain to her what we were celebrating because she was 2 and didn't need to know. I told my grandmother-in-law the following week. She nodded and said, "Good, clean lines." I thought about that phrase a lot afterward. Clean lines. It was how she seemed to approach everything, not coldly, but without unnecessary clutter. She knew what mattered, and she organized her life around it. What mattered to her, I came to understand, was continuity. Not the kind of continuity that's about maintaining appearances. She had little patience for that. The kind that's about building something real enough to outlast you. Her late husband had built something. She had spent 50 years helping him build it, and then, after he died, she had spent her energies on making sure it went somewhere meaningful. Her grandson, my ex-husband, had removed himself from that picture. He had done it. I eventually understood from things she said in fragments over years of lunches, by demonstrating a pattern of choices that told her exactly who he was. Leaving me was just the most recent data point. She never said any of this directly. She was not a direct person exactly. She was a careful one. In the third year, she asked me to attend a board meeting for the Family Foundation. She said she wanted my perspective on the education grants portfolio. I said I didn't think that was appropriate, given my status as the ex-wife of her grandson. She said that my status as the mother of her great-granddaughter and a professional in education policy was what was relevant, and she would handle the appropriateness questions herself. I went to the meeting. I gave my perspective. I was asked back. In the fourth year, she asked her attorney to draft an amendment to her estate documents. She told me about it at lunch, straightforwardly, the way she told me most things. She said she was leaving a portion of her estate in trust for my daughter, with me as the trustee until my daughter turned 25. She said the remainder of her estate had already been allocated, and this amendment was not a disruption to those plans, simply an addition. She said she had thought carefully about it and was at peace with the decision. I asked her if she was certain. She said she was 81 years old, not confused. I didn't argue. He called in October of the fourth year. My daughter was 4.5. She was in preschool. She had a best friend, named after a flower, a favorite color that changed every 2 weeks, and a strong conviction that dinosaurs were still alive somewhere if you looked in the right place. He called from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. His voice was the same. I hadn't expected that. I'd built up 4 years between us, and I suppose I'd expected him to sound different, older, changed, somehow marked by the time. He just sounded like himself. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he knew he'd made mistakes. He said he wanted to be a father to his daughter, and he thought it was time they met, and he wanted to discuss a path forward for all of them. He said, all of them, as if we were still a them. I let him finish. I waited a moment after he finished. Then I said, I'm glad you called. I do want her to have a relationship with her father. I'll have my attorney contact yours about a visitation arrangement. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd been thinking about something more than just visitation. He said he'd been thinking about whether there was still something worth rebuilding. I said, there isn't, but I meant what I said about visitation. Call your attorney. Another quiet? I heard you've gotten close with my grandmother, he said. His voice had shifted slightly, something careful in it. She's my daughter's great-grandmother, I said. We have lunch sometimes. Right. He paused. I'd like to reconnect with her too. I thought maybe you could. That's between you and her, I said. I'm not a bridge to your family relationships. That's not something I can help with. He said okay. He said he understood. He said he'd have his attorney reach out. He hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a few minutes. My daughter was asleep in the other room. There was a drawing she'd made at school stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. 4 figures with big circle heads that she'd labeled in her developing handwriting. Me, my mom, grandma, and a dog we didn't have, but that she apparently believed we needed. He wasn't in the picture. She hadn't put him there. She was 4.5 and she'd drawn the people who were real to her. I don't know if that's sad. I've thought about it. Probably it's both things at once, sad and honest, the way most truths are when you're willing to look at them straight. His attorney contacted mine the following week. The custody arrangement that resulted was orderly and civil, every other weekend once he established residency in state, which took him another 4 months, and a week in the summer starting when she was 6. My daughter handled it better than I expected. She was adaptable in the way that children sometimes are when they haven't built up years of expecting a different reality. He came to pick her up the first time on a Saturday morning. I answered the door. He looked the same, mostly, with something slightly hollowed around his eyes. He looked at me and then at her, and his face did something complicated that I didn't try to interpret. He said, "She looks like you." I said, "She has her great-great-grandmother's nose, apparently." He didn't say anything to that. My daughter took his hand at the doorway, trustingly, the way children extend trust before they've learned to be careful with it. She was going to have to learn that eventually. I hoped she'd have enough time first. He brought her back at 6 o'clock. She'd had a good time, she reported. They'd gone to the aquarium. There was a jellyfish. She told her great-grandmother about the jellyfish the following Thursday when she came with me to lunch. My grandmother-in-law listened to the full account of the jellyfish with complete attention, the way she always listened to my daughter. Afterward, she looked at me over the table and said quietly, so my daughter couldn't hear, "And how are you?" "I'm fine," I said, genuinely. "Good," she said. She poured more tea. "That's the only interesting outcome." 2 weeks after that, she had a fall in her kitchen. Nothing catastrophic, a fractured wrist, some bruising. But she was 81 and the doctor said she needed to slow down, and her children began the conversation about whether she ought to sell the house and move somewhere with more support. She did not want to move somewhere with more support. She made that clear to everyone involved, including the doctors and her children and at one point her accountant, who had made the mistake of voicing an opinion. She called me one evening and asked if I would take over as the primary contact for the Foundation's Grant Review Committee, at least through the current cycle while she recovered. She said she'd already spoken to the board chair. I said I would. The cycle ran 6 months. At the end of it, I was asked to stay on in an advisory capacity. I said yes, because the work was genuinely interesting and because by that point, my relationship with the Foundation had become its own thing. Not connected to my history with her grandson, not dependent on my relationship with her. Just a piece of work that I was good at and that mattered. That's the part of the story that I think about most. Not the injury, not the long climb back, not the phone call from him in October. This part. The part where something that started as necessity became something I'd chosen, freely, because it was mine. My grandmother-in-law recovered from her fall. She moved into a smaller house, 1 level, closer to her daughter. She still has opinions about children's books. She still reads to my daughter every time we visit, which is every few weeks. My daughter is 5 now, and she has discovered chapter books, and the 2 of them have been working through a series about a girl who solves mysteries with the help of her extremely opinionated cat. She called me last month to tell me she'd finished updating her estate documents with her attorney. She said everything was in order. She said she wanted me to know so I wouldn't be blindsided. I told her I appreciated it. I told her she wasn't allowed to die for another 20 years minimum. She said that was probably not up to me, but she'd take it under advisement. I drove home that afternoon through the city in the late afternoon light, my daughter asleep in the back seat with her library book open on her lap, and I thought about the note on the post-it. "We'll figure everything out when the time is right." He had believed, I think, that everything referred to his timeline and his convenience and his eventual decision about when to re-enter the story. He had not understood that the story had moved on without him. That is the thing about stepping away from your own life. You cannot always step back into the same place. Sometimes you step away and the river keeps moving, and when you return, you find that the people you left didn't stand still and wait. They crossed to somewhere you can't easily follow. I am not angry at him anymore. I was, for a long time. A real and specific anger. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet daily kind. The kind that lives in the back of your chest when you're signing your name alone on a lease, or assembling a crib by yourself at midnight, or explaining to a 2-year-old why daddy isn't coming to her birthday party. That anger burned down on its own eventually. What's left is just clarity. My daughter drew another picture last week. The circle-headed figures again, the big crayon smiles. She labeled them the same as before: me, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and then, in the corner, a new addition. A small circle with a triangle hat that she identified when I asked, as her father. He was in the corner of the picture. He was in the picture. That was enough. That was the right size for what he was in her life right now, and it might grow or it might not, and either way she would be okay, because the people at the center of the picture were solid. I taped it to the refrigerator next to the old one. The jellyfish magnet is holding up both of them now. The jellyfish magnet is still on the refrigerator. That's what I keep coming back to when I try to make sense of how any of this happened. It sounds small, a $2 magnet from the aquarium gift shop, holding up 2 crayon drawings on my kitchen fridge. But when I look at it, I see the whole 4 years compressed into one image. What I built, who helped me build it, and what it cost me to stay standing long enough to build anything at all. I didn't do everything right. I want to be honest about that. There were decisions I made in those early months that came from desperation as much as clarity. Calling my grandmother-in-law wasn't some elegant long game. It was a woman with a newborn and $40,200 and no income making the most rational move she could see from where she was standing. Whether that was brave or calculated, I've stopped needing to answer that question. It was necessary, and it was mine. What I've come to believe, after 4 years of living with the consequences of other people's choices and my own, is that outcomes tend to follow character over time. Not perfectly, not neatly. Life isn't a courtroom where every verdict lands exactly right, but over long enough stretches, the way a person actually behaves. The choices they make, when it's inconvenient to be decent, when no one is watching, when it costs something real, that tends to determine where they end up. My ex-husband is not a monster. I think that's important to say. He's someone who, when things got hard, quietly calculated that his own comfort was worth more than his responsibility and acted accordingly. The note on the post-it wasn't cruelty. It was just the truest thing he ever said to me about who he was. He told me exactly what I needed to know, and I finally listened. My grandmother-in-law is someone who, when confronted with a daughter-in-law she'd never met calling from a borrowed number with a 4-day-old baby and no plan, asked how the baby was before she asked anything else. That told me who she was. I listened to that too. Intelligence, the real kind, not just being smart at things, is knowing which information matters. It's noticing what someone does, not just what they say. It's running the calculation and being honest about what the numbers actually show, even when the answer isn't what you hoped. I had to get good at that in those months. I didn't have the luxury of seeing what I wanted to see anymore. But intelligence alone doesn't get you through a night when your daughter won't stop crying and you haven't slept in 40 hours, and you're trying to calculate whether you can make next month's rent. That takes something else. That takes the decision, made in the dark with no audience, to get up again anyway, to apply for the job, to go to the meeting, to answer the phone when the attorney calls, to keep choosing the life you're trying to build even when it doesn't feel like anything is working yet. My daughter is 5 now. She is funny and stubborn and convinced that dinosaurs are still out there somewhere. She draws pictures of the people who are real to her, and she puts them at the center of the page. She will learn, eventually, that the world isn't always fair, that people don't always stay, that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee an easy outcome. I can't protect her from those lessons. What I can do is make sure she grows up watching someone who faced them honestly and kept going anyway. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but without pretending they weren't happening. That's what I have to give her. I think it's enough.